Lonely rancher bought a deaf girl sold by her drunk father, then realized she heard. Texas, 1881. The late season sun-baked the dirt into the timber framework of the trading village. Horses neighed, livestock lowed, and fellows shouted over deals with liquor-scented exhales and battered footwear. The final animal sale of fall was wrapping up, but a group still hung around by Apin Entrance, where a chestnut horse trembled, bones prominent beneath her coat, sides marked with crusted wounds. Silas Carrion shifted his brim against the brightness, quiet as always. 35, a fellow formed by earth and quietude. He seldom visited the settlement except for goods or mounts. He had noticed the mare earlier that day and returned now as offers dwindled. His boot soles thudded on the compacted soil as he neared. That was when he spotted her. A young woman barely past 18, positioned right beyond the enclosure, locks stuck to her cheeks, gown ripped at the edge. Her uncovered feet were caked in grime. She uttered nothing, shed no tears. Her gaze drifted, unanchored, as though tracing an invisible path unseen by others. Positioned next to her was a fellow clutching a flask in one grip and a cord in the other. The cord fastened not to a beast, but to her arm. "Gotta mute one right here," the inebriate yelled to nobody specific. "Sprung from my initial spouse, I reckon. She don't chat, don't listen either. But she scrubs, prepares meals, don't backtalk. Inexpensive." A handful of men laughed grimly. One hawked onto the earth. Silas pivoted aside. He wanted no part of this. He had arrived for a steed. But then he sensed it. Not a sound, not a sob, just a stare. The young woman was observing him. No urgency in her expression, no begging in her posture. Just a gaze, sharp, still locked on his features. And in that gaze was something he hadn't encountered in ages, comprehension, or perhaps a reflection of his own isolation. The inebriate lurched nearer. "You got money. Want the steed?" She tags along. "I ain't hauling her home. Not worth the filth on her feet." Silas paused. The mare scraped at the soil, snorting foam from her muzzle. The young woman's stare remained steady. He faced back, met the inebriate's eyes. "I'll claim both." The chuckles from the surrounding men erupted swift and coarse. "You acquiring beasts or building a harem, Silas?" one yelled. Silas offered no reply. He tallied coins into the fellow's palm. Sufficient for a mount, not sufficient for a spirit. The man jerked the cord toward himself, but the young woman recoiled, moving behind Silas without thinking. "She belongs to you now," the inebriate mumbled. "Don't claim I didn't caution you." "Ain't worth nourishing." Silas loosened the cord, flung it back. He led the mare from the enclosure, the young woman trailing behind with gentle, purposeful strides. She carried nothing except the slender wrap slung over her arms. When they arrived at this cart, she halted, lingered, still wordless. He unlatched the rear and gestured for her to get aboard. She complied, tucking herself into the nook like someone accustomed to fading away. As he ascended to the driver's seat, he detected the slightest pull on his jacket. He glanced downward. Her digits, tiny, roughened, had grazed his cuff just once. She avoided his eyes now. Her focus settled on the far-off ridges, but in that lone contact he perceived it. She had not expressed gratitude, had not implored, but she had decided in that instant to rely on him. Silas Carrion, who conversed more with steeds than people, who dwelled solitary on 200 acres of crimson Texas soil with barriers for companionship and marks he never labeled. And now a young woman who could not perceive sounds, a young woman who might grasp more than anyone had ever suspected. He flicked the reins. The cart groaned ahead, wheels grinding over the firm dirt path leaving the village. Behind him, the young woman sat huddled under a cover, features angled to the breeze. She never glanced rearward. Neither did he. The cart trundled through twilight and grit, meandering amid shallow rises and dotted mesquite until the pastures broadened and the heavens expanded into Texas vastness. Silas's spread wasn't impressive to behold, merely a primary dwelling with a tilted top, several sheds, and an extended span of grassland where herds fed beneath vast skis. But it was peaceful, orderly, and for a fellow like him, it had always sufficed until this point. He assisted the young woman down from the cart, uncertain if she would flee or stiffen, but she descended nimbly to the earth. Her gaze scanned the terrain, not terrified, just vigilant, as if inventorying all without seeking approval. Within the cooking area, Silas kindled the flames and indicated the pot. She affirmed with a nod and proceeded toward it without delay, locating the metal mugs and scoop like someone who'd always fit near flames and appetite. Still, she hadn't produced a noise. After the meal, he passed her a stick of chalk from the cupboard and rapped the timber door jamb next to the table. "Name," he uttered gradually. She regarded him for an extended instant, then knelt by the jamb. With precise digits, she inscribed a lone name in gentle, tilted script. "Emlane," he scanned it once, then again. "Emlane," he echoed aloud, like sampling how it felt on the breeze. She offered no grin, but she pivoted and proceeded into the shadowed outbuilding. The following dawn, Silas discovered her in the barn, knelt next to the same worn-out mare. The horse had scarcely fed since the sale, its rear limb inflamed from prior injury. Emmeline traced a moist rag along the mare's side, murmuring with her palms, not phrases, not gestures, just the steady cadence of someone who attuned with her hands and her inhales. Silas stood at the barn door, arms crossed. He had seen seasoned ranch hands get kicked for less, but the mare stayed still, shuddering only slightly, and let the girl wrap its leg with quiet patience. Maybe she couldn't hear, but she sure as hell understood. That day, Silas gave her chores, simple things. Wash the floorboards, boil water, clean the tack room. She did them without complaint, without asking, without one sound. Each night he left chalk for her, and she would write notes in the margins of their world. Bacon low, dog limping, wind smells like dust. They never spoke, but the quiet didn't feel empty until the storm came. It started like most Texas storms, slow and deceitful. A hot breeze rose around sundown, brushing against the long grass like warning breath. Silas glanced at the sky, noticed a line of clouds brewing far off, but thought nothing of it. He was in the cattle shed when she appeared. Emmeline, barefoot, wild-made, breath quick but soundless. She grabbed his sleeve and tugged hard. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands trembling, her eyes said what her mouth could not. "Down." He hesitated halfway through checking a sick calf, but something in her gaze snapped him into motion. She pulled again toward the barn door away from the corral. Then it happened. A crack. No, a shatter. The world split in two as a bolt of lightning dropped from the heavens, striking the tree that loomed just behind the cattle shed. The blast shook the earth beneath them. Sparks flew. The tree burst into flame and collapsed with a moan that sounded like the sky weeping. Silas stumbled back. The calves bleated in terror. Smoke curled into the sky. He looked at her. Emmeline stood frozen just outside the doorway, her face lit by the flickering fire, eyes steady, chest rising fast. She had known, not guessed, not sensed after the wind rose. She had known before thunder, before the air changed. Silas walked toward her, slow, still half in shock. "How did you?" But she only looked at him, silent, certain. That night, after the fire was doused and the animals calmed, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. No chalk this time, no words, just a man with his hands on the wood and a girl who could not speak. And yet somehow she'd heard something no one else could. Not thunder, not wind, but the warning inside the world. Silas realized for the first time in years he wasn't alone. He looked at her hands folded in her lap. "Emaine," he said again. She lifted her eyes to meet his silence answered. And it was enough. Since the storm, Silas had started to pay more attention, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity of a man who had lived too long in silence, and now found himself staring at something he could not explain, and maybe did not want to. Emmeline never spoke. She never signed, never wrote much more than her name. She had no books, no formal learning, no words, and yet there were days when it seemed like she understood more than anyone he had ever known. One morning, when the head cow stood alone in the pasture not eating, Silas chalked it up to the cold. He made a note to watch her. But Emmeline, she moved without hesitation. She brought straw to the birthing stall, drew water with mint leaves from the well, and stood beside the cow, stroking her belly in slow, measured circles. By sunset, the cow was in labor. She had known. Somehow she had known. Silas said nothing, but he watched her. That night he could not sleep. The next day he tried again. He came back from town with tension in his shoulders, the weight of old history heavy on his back. The sheriff had spoken in half-truths and warnings about claims on the land. Whispers that his father had taken more than was rightfully his during the war. Bloodshed, relocation, guilt, none of it was new, but it never stopped stinging. He did not speak a word of it to Emmeline, but when he sat on the front step staring out into the falling dusk, she came and stood beside him. She did not speak. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder, light as a breeze, steady as breath. After a long moment, Silas muttered, "How did you know that I feel shame over this land? Shame about what my father did to keep it?" Emmeline's dark eyes searched his. Then slowly she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest right over his heart. After that, she turned and walked toward the old oak tree where his father's grave rested silent under the Texas sky. She had never read the stone, never asked questions, and yet she knew. At night, Silas tossed in bed, sweating through a dream of cannon fire and scorched hills. His father's voice came through the smoke, rough, proud, trembling. "I gave you the land, Silas, and I gave you the blood on it." Silas woke with a start, his breath loud in the stillness, and then he saw her. Emmeline sat in a chair by the hearth. She had lit a single candle. In the flickering light, her profile looked carved from shadow and grace. On the table beside the candle was a blue handkerchief, faded, trimmed with hand-stitched lace, his mother's. Silas had not seen it in 10 years. It had been locked away in a cedar chest. No one else touched. He sat up. How? Emmeline didn't look at him. She rose without a sound and walked to the door. She didn't need to explain. He had heard something no one else could. Not words, not memories, but pain, grief, the silent weight of guilt pressed between ribs, the aching sound of a man's heart breaking when he was too proud to let it be heard. And in her quiet, she answered. She heard. And for the first time in Silas's life, he feared not for his land, nor his legacy, nor even his soul. He feared losing the one person who knew what he felt before he ever said a word. The first whisper came from the blacksmith's wife. "She stares too long at the cattle," she said, folding breadcloths under the porch, voice low but sharp as wire, like she knows which one will fall next. By the end of the week, it was the preacher's son who added more wood to the fire. "She touched our goat," he told a circle of curious ears. And 2 days later, it gave birth too early. "That ain't natural." No one had ever heard Emmeline speak, and the fewer words she gave, the more the town seemed eager to fill the silence for her with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her child behind her when Emmeline walked by, even though she only came to fetch flour. At the post, someone spat near her feet. Most days, she kept her head down. She never flinched. But Silas saw the way her fingers curled tighter around the basket in her arms, and how her footsteps became quieter, as if trying to disappear from ground that refused to forget. He did not speak of it to her, and she never asked why the world could not stand to see quiet kindness. But one afternoon, when a ranch-hand's boy came down with a burning fever, red-faced and seizing in his sleep, it was not the doctor who came. It was Emily. She moved softly into the barn where the child lay. She did not ask permission. She merely knelt beside the cot, placed a hand on the boy's chest, then his forehead, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she walked outside, cut 3 types of herbs from Silas's drying wall, lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco, and returned with a hot cloth. The boy drank the steeped leaves in silence. By sunrise, he was sitting up hungry again. His mother wept, held Emmeline's hand with trembling thanks. But the next day, she could be heard whispering at the well. She did not ask what the boy's symptoms were. How did she know? How did she know? The fear was no longer quiet. 3 days later, they came with torches, not lit, but carried like promises. 8 men and women, boots kicking up dust, stood at the gate of Silas's ranch. The oldest among them, Mr. Withers, a man whose own daughter had not spoken to him in years, stepped forward. "We want her gone," he said. "That girl hears things she ought not." Silas stood in the barn's doorway, arms folded across his chest. He had not shaved in days, and his face was hard as the timber framing behind him. "She's mute," he said. "That ain't the same as deaf," Withers snapped. "She sees what's coming before the sky even shifts. She talks to animals like they talk back. A steer of mine dropped dead last week, and she was the only one who touched it. You think she cursed it? I think she's cursed, period." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside the house, Emmeline stood behind the curtain. She had heard the gravel shift under their boots. She had seen their faces twisted, not with hate, but something worse. Certainty. She moved to open the door, but Silas held up a hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly in the thawing mud, and faced them squarely. She saved a child's life. Maybe she's the one who gave him the fever in the first place, a woman spat. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. She is the only person I know who listens, he said. Not with ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her whole damn soul. The crowd stilled. I have lived 35 years, he continued, voice low, boot and shaking, and I can count on one hand the number of people who truly heard me. Not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief. And she did without saying a single thing. He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping over them. You want to run someone off for being different? For seeing the world you're too afraid to face? Fine, but you'll have to go through me. Withers opened his mouth, then closed it. No one moved. Then slowly the crowd dispersed, torches unused, boots heavy. That night, the ranch was silent except for the wind. Inside, Emmeline placed a pot of warm cider on the fire, then moved beside Silas at the table. She did not sign, did not write, did not even look at him. But after a moment, she reached out, rested her fingers on his hand. It was not thanks, it was recognition. He turned his palm upward, curled his fingers gently around hers, and together, in the stillness, they listened to the crackle of the wood, the hush of the night, and the bond growing between two souls that never needed words to speak. The first snowfall of December came quiet and slow, like someone laying down a blanket over all that had burned or broken. Emmeline stood by the window of the log kitchen, her fingers threading a needle through scraps of old fabric, leather patches, wool cuffs, the lining from an old coat Silas no longer wore. She was making a cloak, not for herself, but for him. She did not need to har the wind to know the cold was coming. Silas watched her from the barn door. She moved with purpose, every motion deliberate. She had no words. But in the weeks since the townsfolk had turned away, and he had chosen to keep her there, his world had found rhythm again. She brewed coffee every morning before the sky turned gray. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles. She brushed the horses in slow circles and trained the yearlings using gestures no cowboy had ever thought to try. He had never seen animals respond that way to someone. She would stand still just long enough for a skittish foal to inch closer. Then she'd raise a single hand slow and open and wait. And somehow always they listened. The silence around the ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. One late afternoon, Silas rode out toward the ridge, checking the fences before the storm they both knew was coming. The light had just begun to dim when his horse startled. A loose rock maybe, or a scent on the wind, and reared. He was thrown hard, landing shoulder first on frozen earth. The breath rushed from his chest. For a moment he could not feel anything but the throbbing pulse of pain where his arm struck a jutting root. He staggered to his feet, bleeding from the elbow. The sky was deepening fast. He wrapped a cloth around the wound and tried to walk, but each step sent sharp pain through his ribs. When he stumbled into the yard, the last light had faded. Emmeline burst from the cabin before he could knock. She had felt it. Or perhaps she had just known one of those strange, uncanny instincts of hers that no one could explain. She helped him inside, sat him down by the hearth, and peeled the cloth from his wound with gentle fingers. Her brow furrowed as she worked. She brought water, cleaned the gash, and pressed a puss of yarrow and pine sap against it. He watched her. "You always know," he whispered. She met his eyes. Then without warning, she lifted his hand to her face, then pressed her lips soft, warm, against the edge of the wound. Silas stilled. The fire cracked, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Emmeline did not speak. She did not smile, but something passed between them like a door opening in the quiet. Later, as the storm rolled in and snow dusted the window panes, Silas sat across from her at the table. He had taken a piece of paper from his desk drawer and written slowly, carefully, each letter shaped with meaning that could not be spoken aloud. He turned it to face her. "I want to hear your heart," it read, "if you'll let me listen with mine." She looked at the words for a long time. Then her fingers reached out and touched them one by one as if to feel the truth inside the ink. When she finally raised her eyes, they were wet, but not from sorrow. She reached across the table and touched his chest. Just once, just enough. And then, for the first time since she had entered his life, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of fear or thanks, but a smile like sunrise, like something breaking free after being held in too long. Outside, the wind howled, but inside that cabin, a silence deeper than words had found its voice, and it was warm, and it was real. The days softened. Winter still gripped Therages, but between storms, life returned slowly. So did something else, something quiet and steady between Silas and Emmeline. She taught him sign language, water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like branches in the wind. And though he fumbled, she never laughed, only touched his hands, guiding them until he got it. He taught her to ride. She had never sat a saddle before. The first time she clung to the horn, knuckles white, but he walked beside her, speaking low though she could not hear. She moved with the horse anyway, sensing its rhythm through her bones. They built a small room off the cabin, part shelter, part refuge. There they shared meals and silence by the fire. They did not need words. Their glances said more than language could. He noticed things. She smiled when birds gathered at dusk. She flinched at sudden pops in the fire. She always knew a storm before it came. One night he spelled a sentence in shaky signs. "You make this place full." She stared, then touched her fingers to his lips. Not a kiss, just a thank you. A way of saying I hear you too. Then came the storm. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire after repairing fences all day. The sky had been calm. No warning, the lantern flickered low. He woke to her hand on his shoulder. Emmeline. She pulled his coat and pointed toward the barn. Outside, the wind had shifted. Clouds raced past the moon. The air felt wrong, electric. In the barn, the horses thrashed. Emmeline moved through them like wind, touching each flank, calm and certain. A loud creak overhead. Silas looked up. A beam cracked. "We need to move them," he shouted. But she was already leading the mare out, signing fast, "Roof will fall now." Together they moved the horses to the shelter near the house. Rain hit the roof like fists. Just as the last animal cleared the door, the north beam gave way. The roof crashed where they had just stood. Silas turned. Emmeline stood, watching the barn collapse, hair soaked, chest rising. He looked at her. Truly looked. She was still grounded, a part of the wind and rain, not separate from it. "How did you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed to Thesky. He understood. She felt it. Later in the cabin, he handed her a blanket and sat beside her. He took her hand and spelled, "You belong to this land." She smiled, then placed his hand on her chest over her heart. And for the first time, he felt her rhythm, quiet, steady. She did not hear like others. She heard deeper, and Silas in that moment knew he had finally been heard, too. The wind that once carried whispers now brought footsteps. Hesitant, then trusting, something had shifted in the town beyond Silas's fences, not loudly, not suddenly, but in silence as mostrial change begins. The first was Tom Weaver, a ranch hand with a torn shoulder. The doctor was out east and no one else knew how to wrap a wound, right? He arrived one gray morning, reins in one hand, the other arm limp. Silas spotted him from the porch. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom nodded past him to where was kneeling by Herb Patch. "Heard she fixes things quiet." Silas gave a slow nod. "She does." Emmeline came without a word. She examined the arm, her hands steady, her brow creased in thought. She moved as if listening not to words, but to something deeper. When she pressed the right spot, Tom winced, then sighed. 2 days later, a widow came. She had not slept in weeks. Emmeline sat with her at dusk, hands gently resting on her shoulders until the shaking stopped. The next morning, the woman returned with API and a hand-kit scarf. "For the girl," she said. "The one who hears more than we do." That winter passed with fewer raised voices, fewer names spat in fear. Silas and Emmeline lived as before, quietly. But now passing townsfolk tipped their hats. Some left preserves by the gate. Each morning, Emmeline wrote on the chalkboard beside the kitchen, "Today will be good. I can feel it." Sometimes she was wrong, but most days she was right, and slowly people believed it. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. The frost had just lifted. The church bell rang, and before its echo faded, panic spread. A 7-year-old boy had vanished from his family during morning chores. One boot was found near the tree ine. Nothing more. Men shouted, mothers cried, dogs barked. When Silas and Emmeline heard, he reached for his coat. Emmeline, already beside him, placed a hand on his arm, then knelt. She pressed her hands to the earth, palms, wrists, her whole forearm. Then she crawled forward, pausing, tracing subtle marks, a shifted pebble, a broken twig. He stood and walked. He did not look back, but they followed. Silas, then Tom, then others through thickets, up ridges, down dry creek beds, until in a cedar ring clearing, they saw him. The boy curled beneath a bent tree, high-ankle swollen, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Emmeline ran. She knelt, checked his leg, brushed hair from his eyes. Then she looked up at Silas, not proud, not triumphant, just relieved. When the boy was safe and the story retold, no one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who hears with her heart. The wind moved slow that evening, brushing gently over the tall grass, like it remembered every name that had ever been whispered on this land. Years had passed. The ranch still stood, weathered wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a life not hurried. Silas walked a little slower now, and Emmeline's hair had grown long and silver thread, but neither of them kept track of years and numbers. They counted time in seasons, in moments held quietly between two hands. In the soundless way a heart says, I'm still here. The children came most mornings from the town, from the edge of the hills, from places where words were often thrown too fast or forgotten too easily. Here they found something else. They learned to listen, not with ears, but with their whole being. They sat with Emmeline in the garden as she taught them how to know the difference between fear and shyness. In the twitch of Arabet's nose, they stood beside her in the stable and watched her place a single hand on a horse's flank, calming it with nothing but her breath. She did not teach with rules. She taught with silence, and with the rare, precious way she smiled when they understood something without having to say it out loud. Silas built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. That's where they sat most evenings, he and Emmeline, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun settle into the hills. On those evenings, neither spoke much. They didn't have to. He would pour 2 mugs of tea, still warm from the kettle, and she would take his hand, thumb tracing a slow rhythm across the back of it. Sometimes he would bring out an old harmonica and play a tune with no name, and she would close her eyes and sway as if she could feel the song ripple through the dusk. Then one evening, a shadow stretched across the wheat field, and a hush fell over the trees. Emmeline turned to him. She had learned a little speech over the years, not much, just enough to read lips and shape a few careful words. Most days she still preferred her hands, but this time she spoke with her voice. A voice not used to being heard, soft as a leaf falling in snow. I do not need sound, she whispered. Only you, Silas blinked. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded gently. His throat tightened as he answered, I hear you. Always have. They stayed like that until the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, a new group of children arrived. Emmeline wrote a sentence in chalk across the wooden slate nailed beside the front door. She did it every morning like a ritual. Today it read, the day will be kind. I feel it. No one asked how she knew. They just believed her. And when the old folks in town talked about the girl who once could not speak or hear, they did not whisper the word witch anymore. They called her the one who listens with her heart. Some still shook their heads in doubt, but most just smiled or nodded or came by with a pie and stayed long enough to leave with something gentler in their chest. That winter a boy got lost during a snowstorm. Emmeline knelt in the snow outside the barn, pressed her palms to the ground, and tilted her face to the wind. Then she stood, pointed west. Silas followed her for 3 miles through a grove of pine until they found the boy curled beneath a fallen log, alive, frightened, but safe. They never questioned her again after that. The final scene of the year found Silas and Emmeline walking together through the pasture. The sky was wide, brushed with amber and lilac. Their steps were slow, steady. A mare and her foal grazed nearby. The world was quiet but never empty. They stopped at the top of the hill. Emmeline turned to him, and for the first time laughed, not a loud sound, but a ripple of air that shook her shoulders and lit her face like dawn. Silas smiled and kissed her temple. No one told their story. It didn't need to be told because it was still happening. And sometimes the truest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the kind that walks beside you in silence every day and never asks to be anything more than real. If your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood without words, if you believe that love does not need a voice to be heard, only a soul brave enough to feel, then the story of Silas and Emmeline was meant for you, out on the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak in the same tongue. A lonely rancher and a girl, the world called deaf, discovered a language deeper than sound, a language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If stories of love that endure through prejudice, pain, and unspoken grace speak to you, subscribe to the Wild West Love Stories channel. Here, love is not just told, it's remembered, it's reclaimed, and it echoes long after the last word fades. We'll see you again in the next story. Until then, may your quiet moments be full, and may someone always hear the heart you carry.